December 1880. South Africa's windswept veld is the setting as an empire stumbles into a war it cannot understand. A brief and inconsequential skirmish turns into a humiliating defeat. The British Empire, its rifles newly mass-produced, its cannons freshly thundered into shape, its egos resplendent in scarlet, outwitted by mounted farmers. Within 3 months, Britain's great lion is humbled by an independent Boer republic. This is the story of the First Boer War, Britain's unexpected defeat. To understand the First Boer War, we must travel back to the middle of the 19th century, when Britain's hunger for empire began to consume the British reach furthest in Africa. The Cape Colony was annexed by the British in 1806, but the Dutch-descended Boers, also called Afrikaners, were bitter about this foreign dominion and British law. Disillusioned, the Boers embarked on the Great Trek, heading north into the interior to create their own independent republics, the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, or the Transvaal. These were hard, self-reliant societies, founded by farmers, horsemen, and marksmen who had little use for empires, but the British never took their eyes off the Transvaal. In 1877, on the pretext of the Zulu threat of expansion, Sir Theophilus Shepstone annexed the Transvaal. The Boers were outraged. British rule was reimposed, taxes increased, and local self-government was ended. They petitioned London peacefully for 3 years, but diplomacy failed by 1880. On the 13th of December, under Piet Joubert, Paul Kruger, and M.W. Pretorius, the Boers declared the South African Republic independent once again. The war had begun. The Boer Declaration of Independence in December 1880 was not just a political act, it was a call to arms. Within days, the Boers mobilized their commandos, highly mobile units of mounted riflemen drawn from the rural farming population. These men, raised on the hunt and hardened by frontier life, were anything but professional soldiers. But they were good shots, fine horsemen, and knew the country like the back of their hand. On the other hand, the British authorities in the Transvaal were unprepared. At Pretoria, the British administrator, Colonel Owen Lanyon, ridiculed the rebellion, believing that the Empire's superiority in discipline and firearms would crush any resistance. He had underestimated the Boers' organisation and speed. On December 20th, 1880, a British column of 259 men under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Anstruther, marching from Lydenburg to Pretoria, was ambushed at Bronkhorstspruit. The Boers, concealed behind ridges and trees, called on Anstruther to surrender. He refused. Within minutes, Boer marksmen unleashed a withering fusillade. The redcoats, clustered together, were mowed down in the open. Over 150 were killed or wounded. The rest surrendered. It was a shattering blow. The British had been humbled in the first battle. Meanwhile, Boer armies besieged every large British garrison across the Transvaal: Potchefstroom, Standerton, Rustenburg, and Lydenburg. Outnumbered and isolated, the British troops dug in and waited for reinforcements. The Boers had assaulted with devastating precision. The uprising was no wild tumult. It was a very well-planned war for freedom. Once their initial victory at Bronkhorstspruit, the Boers had a measured and methodical approach: siege warfare. No ordinary ringed-in encircling with trenches and guns, however. The Boers surrounded British garrisons across the Transvaal: Potchefstroom, Lydenburg, Standerton, Marabastad, to mention just a few, not to storm them, but to starve them into surrender. Their tactic was methodical. Boer commandos cut supply lines, disrupted foraging parties, and waited in ambush. Behind the British forts, spirits crumbled soon enough. Supplies ran low. Disease swept through. Communications and messages were severed. Outside, the Boers used trenches and rifle pits, but abandoned mass charges. Why risk casualties when time was theirs? One of the most significant sieges was at Potchefstroom, where Major William Clark commanded a British garrison of approximately 200 men. From December 1880 to March 1881, they endured incessant sniper fire, Boer cannon fire, and shortages. Even with offers of surrender, Clark refused to surrender. Sadly, when he did surrender, He didn't know that peace talks had already begun elsewhere. These sieges illustrated the Boers' brilliance in guerrilla warfare. They knew they could never match British numbers or get the better of British field artillery in open battle. But by bringing the fight to a wear and tear contest, they made the empire commit its own strength against itself. Meanwhile, in Britain, its government was caught off guard. Liberal Prime Minister William Gladstone had never wanted to annex Transvaal in the first place. Now, however, he was being drawn into a colonial war that he had tried to avoid. Although Britain had initial defeats, it would not have its imperial pride wounded without retaliation. Early in January 1881, Natal sent reinforcements led by Major General Sir George Colley, the Governor and High Commissioner for Southeast Africa. Intellectually capable and politically committed to Gladstone, Colley had no experience in guerrilla frontier fighting. Operating from his base in Newcastle, Colley planned to relieve the besieged garrisons and regain British dominance. But first, he needed to cross the Drakensberg Mountains and force his way through the passes in Boer hands. On January 28th, he tried to force through Laing's Neck, an important mountain pass. But the fight was catastrophic. British infantry advanced up the slope in closed formation, deliberate targets for Boer riflemen in holes. The cavalry charge was torn apart. British losses approached 200, compared to fewer than 40 Boers. Poor tactics and underestimation of the enemy again cost the Empire dearly. Not wanting to concede, Colley reorganized. On February 26th, he led a surprise night advance to occupy Majuba Hill, a giant mountain dominating the Boer lines around Laing's Neck. If he could hold it, he would be forced to push the Boers back. But Colley made a fatal mistake. Neither trenched nor posted adequate pickets. The Boers detected his movement and began to prepare a bold counterattack at dawn. The last battle was looming. Majuba would determine the conflict. At dawn on February 27, 1881, the sun rose over Majuba Hill, casting golden light over the British camp atop it. General Colley believed he had bested the Boers. From this position, he had command of the space and could threaten their positions below. But his plan was badly flawed. Colley had led fewer than 500 men in main force infantry, no gun, and little supplies. Worse, he failed to entrench or properly scout the ridges. His men were exhausted from the climb and ill-prepared for a coordinated counterattack. While this was going on, Boer commanders, Commandant General Piet Joubert and Commandant Stephanus Smit, took firm action. While the British camp was still recovering from sleep, more than 450 Boer marksmen started climbing the hill from several sides, employing natural cover to remain undercover. The Boer attack was raw masterfulness. In small parties, crawling, climbing, and shooting with accuracy. Out in the open in the redcoats against the skyline, they could scarcely get back at them. In the late morning, the British crest fell into disorganization. Officers were shot from the ranks. There was too little ammunition. The lines fell apart. In the final hour, desperation clutched at them. British soldiers began to withdraw down the hillsides, only to be cut down in flight. Some jumped to death rather than be captured. Colley, single and likely dazed, was shot through the head, possibly by a sniper. His body was found among the dead, his plan a complete disaster. By early afternoon, the Boers were in triumph on Majuba Hill. British losses were 92 dead, 134 wounded, and 59 captured. The Boers had only 1 dead and 5 wounded. It was one of the most decisive tactical defeats in British military history. The legend of imperial invincibility had been smashed by farmers armed with rifles and determination. The unexpected loss at Majuba Hill shocked Britain. The word came within a week in Newcastle, and the empire was shaken by the news. General Colley was killed. The Transvaal was lost. The world had seen how farmers had outwitted one of the greatest empires the world ever knew. But to the Boers, triumph posed a problem. They had fought for independence, not for war. They sought independence from British control, not conquest. Fortuitously for them, political winds in Britain were shifting. Prime Minister William Gladstone, already of doubting mind about the 1877 annexation, now had mounting pressure on him to end the war. Indignation at Colley's defeat and rising anti-war sentiment gave him the political room to negotiate. On 6 March 1881, the Boers and British agreed to an initial armistice at O'Neill's cottage near Newcastle. Sir Evelyn Wood and Paul Kruger represented each side and met on tense but courteous terms. This was followed by a formal treaty of peace. By August 1881, the Pretoria Convention had been signed. This set the Transvaal under Boer self-government, under nominal British suzerainty. British garrisons were withdrawn. In practice, the South African Republic was independent again. Though the British attempted to save face in legalistic words, the world was aware of what had taken place. A colonial rebellion had defeated the most powerful military power on Earth. The First Boer War had come to an end, but its tensions were barely more than unleashed. The First Boer War was short, little more than 3 months long, but its effects would plague the British Empire for generations. For the British, the war was an embarrassment, a portent of imperial arrogance and the cost of underestimating the determination of the locals. For the Boers, it was a triumph of national determination over imperial might. Their triumph at Majuba Hill was a symbol of autonomy, a mountain with a long shadow, but peace was precarious. The British had not departed from South Africa. They had signed the Pretoria Convention, but they were still deeply involved in affairs on the spot. In 1884, the treaty was renegotiated through the London Convention to grant the Transvaal even greater autonomy, but resentment lingered on both sides. The war also spawned reform. British military planners studied the Boer warfighting tactics closely. The British Army then improved its tactics, although not in time. Meanwhile, the Boers grew bolder. Led by Paul Kruger, the South African Republic prospered. But tensions would again build when gold was found in the Witwatersrand in 1886. Foreign prospectors, mainly British, flooded into the Boer Republic, along with imperialism. By the 1890s, tensions between British expansion and Boer independence had boiled over anew. In 1899, the Second Boer War erupted, longer, bloodier, and far more brutal. But the First War, the war that's been forgotten, exposed the vulnerabilities of the empire. It was not a war of gold or empire, but of freedom and self-rule. In the end, the First Boer War wasn't an afterthought. It was a warning one the empire would heed at its own cost. The First Boer War was more than a colonial war. It was a catalyst, feeding debates on power, identity, and resistance. The red-coated empire had blinked, and in that blink of an eye, a small republic had seized its destiny. But history was not yet through with the Boers, or with South Africa. The next chapter would be far bloodier. This was the story of Britain's unexpected defeat, the complete history of the First Boer War.